John Anthony Frusciante was born in Queens, New York City on March 1970. His father, John Augustus Frusciante, is a Juilliard-trained pianist, who later became a lawyer and then circuit court judge in Florida. His mother, Gail Bruno, was a promising vocalist who gave up her career to be a stay-at-home mother. Frusciante is of Italian ancestry. Frusciante's family moved to Tucson, Arizona, and then Florida, where his father served as a Broward County judge until October 2010. His parents separated and he and his mother moved to Santa Monica, California. A year later, Frusciante and his mother moved to Mar Vista, Los Angeles with his new stepfather. He became involved in the Los Angeles punk rock scene. At age 9, he became fixated on the Germs, listening repeatedly to their album GI. He would later use a non-standard tuning of his own invention to play songs from the album's single finger bar. Frusciante began studying guitarists such as Jeff Beck, Jimmy Page, David Gilmour, and Jimi Hendrix at 11, and he discovered Frank Zappa, whose work he would study for hours. He dropped out of high school at age 16 with the permission of his parents, and upon completion of a proficiency test, with their support he moved to Los Angeles to develop his musicianship. He began taking classes at the Guitar Institute of Technology, but turned to punching in without actually attending and left shortly thereafter. Frusciante discovered the Red Hot Chili Peppers around 1984 when his guitar instructor was auditioning as a guitarist for them. Frusciante attended a Red Hot Chili Peppers performance at age 15 and rapidly became a devoted fan. He idolized guitarist Hillel Slovak, familiarizing himself with virtually all the guitar and bass parts from the Red Hot Chili Peppers' first 3 records. He became acquainted with Slovak the 2 months before Slovak's death. Frusciante became friends with former Dead Kennedys drummer D.H. Peligro in early 1988. They jammed together and Peligro invited his friend Red Hot Chili Peppers bassist Flea. Frusciante and Flea developed musical chemistry immediately, with Flea later acknowledging that might have been the day he first played the bass riff to the future track Nobody Weird Like Me. Around the same time, Frusciante intended to audition for Frank Zappa's band, but changed his mind as Zappa strictly prohibited illegal drug use. Frusciante said, "I realized that I wanted to be a rock star, do drugs and get girls, and that I wouldn't be able to do that if I was in Zappa's band." Slovak died of a heroin overdose in 1988. Red Hot Chili Peppers drummer Jack Irons devastated and left the group. Remaining members Flea and vocalist Anthony Kiedis recruited Peligro on drums and Dwayne Blackbird McKnight, formerly of Parliament Funkadelic, on guitar. However, McKnight failed to connect musically within the group. Flea proposed auditioning Frusciante, whose intimate knowledge of the Red Hot Chili Peppers repertoire impressed him. Flea and Kiedis auditioned him and agreed that he would be a suitable replacement for McKnight. When Flea called Frusciante with the news of his acceptance, Frusciante ran through his house screaming with joy and jumped on a wall, leaving permanent boot marks. He was considering a contract with Thelonious Monster at the time and had been playing with the act for 2 weeks, but his unanticipated reception into the Red Hot Chili Peppers prompted him to change his plans. Frusciante was not familiar with the funk genre of Red Hot Chili Peppers sound. Several weeks into the band's new lineup, Peligro, whose performance was suffering due to extreme drug abuse, was fired. Soon after, Chad Smith was recruited as drummer and the new lineup began recording their first album Mother's Milk in 1989. Frusciante focused on emulating Slovak style. Producer Michael Beinhorn disagreed with this approach and wanted Frusciante to play with an uncharacteristic heavy metal tone, largely absent from the band's 3 preceding records. Frusciante and Beinhorn fought frequently over guitar tone and layering. Beinhorn prevailed as Frusciante felt pressured by his knowledge of the studio. Kiedis recalls that Beinhorn wanted John to have a big, crunching, almost metal-sounding guitar tone, whereas before we always had some interesting acid rock guitar tones as well as a lot of slinky, sexy, funky guitar tones. The Chili Peppers collaborated with producer Rick Rubin for their second record with Frusciante, Blood Sugar Sex Magic, in 1991. Rubin felt that it was important to record the album in an unorthodox setting and suggested an old Hollywood Hills mansion. Frusciante, Kiedis and Flea isolated themselves there for the duration of the recording. Frusciante and Flea seldom went outside and spent most of their time smoking marijuana. Around this time Frusciante began a side project with Flea and Jane's Addiction drummer Stephen Perkins, the Three Amoebas. They recorded roughly 10 to 15 hours of material which went unreleased. Frusciante had developed serious drug habits while touring with the Chili Peppers. He said that when he found out that Flea was stoned out of his mind at every show, that inspired me to be a pothead. He used heroin and was on the verge of full-scale addiction. Upon returning to California in 1992, Frusciante entered a deep depression, feeling that his life was over and that he could no longer write music or play the guitar. He spent the next 3 years in his Hollywood Hills home, the walls of which were badly damaged and covered in graffiti. During this time his friends Johnny Depp and Gibby Haynes went to his house and filmed a documentary short, Stuff, depicting the squalor in which he was living. The house was eventually destroyed by a fire that also destroyed Frusciante's vintage guitar collection and several recordings. Frusciante focused on painting, producing 4-track recordings he had made while working on Blood Sugar Sex Magik and writing short stories and screenplays. To cope with his worsening depression, Frusciante increased his heroin use and spiraled into a life-threatening dependency. In 1993 Frusciante briefly performed with the band P alongside Depp, the Butthole Surfers frontman Gibby Haynes, the actor Sal Jenko and the songwriter Bill Carter. The band often played gigs at the Viper Room, including a performance with Flea on October 1993. According to Gibby Haynes, the band was performing their song Michael Stipe when outside the venue River Phoenix was having seizures on the sidewalk. Phoenix died in the early hours of October 31st of heart failure, brought on by an overdose of cocaine and heroin at the age of 23. In his book Running with Monsters, Bob Forrest wrote that River Phoenix and Frusciante spent the days preceding Phoenix's death together on a drug binge, consuming cocaine and heroin without sleeping for days. A 1996 article in the New Times LA described Frusciante as a skeleton covered in thin skin who weighed little more than 40 kilograms at the nadir of his addictions and nearly died from a blood infection. His arms were fiercely scarred from self-harming as well as improperly shooting heroin and cocaine, leaving permanent abscesses. Frusciante released his second solo album, Smile from the Streets You Hold, in 1997. The album's first track, Enter is characterized by cryptic lyrics and hysterical screeches. In late 1996, after more than 5 years of addiction to heroin, Frusciante went cold turkey. However, months later he was still unable to break addictions to crack cocaine and alcohol. In January 1998, urged by his longtime friend Bob Forrest, Frusciante checked into Las Encinas, a drug rehabilitation clinic in Pasadena. He was diagnosed with a potentially lethal oral infection which could only be alleviated by removing his rotten teeth and replacing them with dental implants. He also received skin grafts to help repair the abscesses on his ravaged arms. About a month later, Frusciante checked out of Las Encinas. Frusciante began living a more spiritual ascetic lifestyle. He changed his diet, becoming more health conscious, and began eating mostly unprocessed foods. Through regular practice of vipassana and yoga, he discovered the effect that self-discipline has on the body. To maintain his increased spiritual awareness and reduce distraction from his music, Frusciante decided to abstain from sexual activity. Despite his experience with addiction, Frusciante does not view his drug use as a dark period in his life. He considers it a period of rebirth, during which he found himself and cleared his mind. Frusciante has since stopped practicing yoga due to its effects on his back, but he still tries to meditate daily. In early 1998, the Red Hot Chili Peppers fired guitarist Dave Navarro and were on the verge of breaking up. Flea told Keatis, "The only way I could imagine carrying on is if we got John back in the band." With Frusciante free of his addictions and ailments, Keatis and Flea thought it was an appropriate time to invite him back. When Flea visited him at his home and asked him to rejoin the band, Frusciante began sobbing and said, "Nothing would make me happier in the world." The group began recording their seventh album, Californication, released in 1999. Frusciante's return restored a key component of the band's sound, as well as a healthy morale. He brought with him his deep devotion to music, which affected the band's recording style during the album. Frusciante has frequently stated that his work on Californication was his favorite. His next solo album to be released was the DC EP. On this production, Frusciante was accompanied by Jerry Busher on drums. Musically, the songs were very similar to The Will to Death, but were different in tone and genre. With this album, John worked with yet another former member of the DC hardcore band Fugazi. Lead guitarist and vocalist for Fugazi Ian MacKaye helped John record and master the album at Ian's Discord Records studio in Washington, D.C. MacKaye even loaned Frusciante his guitar and amps to record on. Frusciante remarked that he was relieved that he still sounded like himself even on someone else's equipment. DC also marked the first album in 5 years that Frusciante had not used a synthesizer of any kind.